Good afternoon, class of 2024. I'm C3C Doyle Gehring, a military history major, and I'd like to welcome y'all to this great opportunity to hear from members of the class of 1970 who participated in the Battle of An Loc from April to July 1972. This event helps us to continue our reflection on warrior ethos and gets us thinking about the future fight in a contested environment. I'd like to introduce the panel members in the order that they'll speak during today's presentation. Please hold your applause until all are introduced. First, an O2A forward air controller during the battle, Lieutenant General retired Tom Waskow. An A-37 close air support pilot, Lieutenant Colonel retired Ken Green. A C-130 co-pilot, Major General retired Jay Berry. An AC-119 gunship co-pilot, Colonel retired Steve McIsaac. An F-4E pilot, General retired Greg Speedy Martin. A B-52 co-pilot during the battle, Major retired Larry Vonn. And another O2A forward air controller, Lieutenant Colonel retired Lou Hatch. After this period, the panel will be joined by their classmates in this room to continue the discussion during M6. You are welcome to stay and ask questions. Now, to provide us with some brief context to this battle and the larger strategic situation, I'd like to welcome Dr. Stephen Randolph, USAFA class of 1974 from the Center for Character and Leadership Development. Dr. Randolph.
Yeah, good afternoon, and a shout out from the class of 74 to the class of 24. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, my assigned task today is to provide the big picture overview for this session to set the context for the remarks that will follow from our honored guests. I have 5 minutes to do this, so let's get started. The men on this stage arrived at the Academy in summer of 1966. Lyndon Johnson was the president, the war in Southeast Asia was escalating, a major ground war was underway, and the Rolling Thunder air campaign was escalating gradually. 4 years later, they graduated with the class of 1970, and all of this had changed. Richard Nixon was now the president. He'd adopted a strategy of building up the South Vietnamese and withdrawing American forces. Negotiations with North Vietnam were in progress, and air power, especially the B-52s, were serving as a rear guard to protect American forces as our ground forces withdrew from the theater. In May 1971, while our speakers were all in pilot training, the North Vietnamese Politburo decided on a roll-of-the-dice nationwide offensive for South Vietnam for the following spring campaign season. It would be designed to crush the South Vietnamese forces, force the downfall of the government of South Vietnam, and lead ultimately to South Vietnam's absorption by the communist North Vietnamese. This offensive would take place on 3 fronts: along the demilitarized zone between North and South Vietnam, in the Central Highlands, and out of the Cambodian base camps threatening Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam. In preparation for this offensive, the North Vietnamese fundamentally changed the nature of their armed forces, going from a guerrilla force to a conventional Soviet-style tank, artillery, infantry force, an extremely impressive feat. The offensive broke over South Vietnam beginning in early April, Easter weekend, 1972. Waves of artillery and infantry struck along the demilitarized zone, rolling back South Vietnamese forces. The second arm of the offensive struck in the Central Highlands, threatening to cut South Vietnam in two. But the greatest threat and the greatest shock emerged from the North Vietnamese base camps in Cambodia, a 3-division armored force heading down Route 13 towards Saigon, first threatening to overrun the provincial capital of An Loc. It was a moment of high peril for the South Vietnamese. It was also a moment when both sides had underestimated their enemy. Nobody expected the North Vietnamese to employ tanks and heavy artillery coming out of Cambodia. But the North Vietnamese, for their part, underestimated President Nixon's response to the offensive. Convinced that a communist victory in Vietnam would shatter his presidency, Nixon flooded Indochina with air power. Victory would go to the side then best able to adapt and adjust to these unexpected circumstances. The North Vietnamese offensive against An Loc opened with 2 ground assaults on April 13th and April 15th, in which they overran half the city. But they were spent, their tank forces destroyed, and so they settled into a siege by road and air, attempting to starve out and destroy the South Vietnamese defenders. The survival of the garrison rested on the ability of air forces to provide firepower, logistics, medevac, the full range of combat capability in the teeth of a determined and capable enemy. So now we'll turn to our honored guests who are among those engaged in this unique and epic battle. As they describe their experiences, I hope you'll bear in mind 3 themes that I think play throughout this narrative. First, the devastating capability and flexibility of air power in modern warfare. Second, the warrior ethos as demonstrated by these men on the field of battle. And third, future warfare. For these graduates, their future war came upon them 2 years after graduation. You don't know when yours will come, but whenever it comes, it will demand of you the same qualities of skill, courage, resilience, and adaptability that these men demonstrated in the skies over An Loc. So let's get started. General Waskow, over to you.
Well, let me start off by saying, Steve, I appreciate your kind introduction. I'm kind of looking forward to what we all have to say. For you in the audience, you're very fortunate to have men like, or instructors, professors like Steve. He was one of my young fighter pilots, as one of the early F-15 pilots back when he was a lieutenant, and he went on and retired as a colonel, and now with his PhD, he is sharing a skill set with you, the cadets of the class of 2024, and I'm thrilled to be part of that. As you listen to what we have to say, there are 3 things I'd like you to keep in mind. The first thing is the incredible impact of air power on any kind of operation globally. Now, that air power has to be commanded by one person, and that is the air component commander. And I want you to think about that, because you as future advocates of air power are going to have to stand in the light of your contemporaries from the other services and listen to them compete with you for resources and other things. The second part I'd like you to remember is the concept of teamwork. We all came from diverse backgrounds, but we had a common mission. That was the one we were trained to do, and that training began here with Siri at the academy and moved up through our military studies until we graduated and wore the ring, which you one day will wear. The third thing is very interesting, but it's a human concept, and that is there is one constant in life, and that's change. And the question is, how do you, as you execute your mission, as you learn to live the Air Force core values, how do you change with the world to make it a better place? So now let's set the stage for what we're going to do today. Graduated from pilot training. 17 months later, I was in Vietnam as a forward air controller. Now, what does a forward air controller do? His responsibility is to act as the conductor of the orchestra. His responsibility is to coordinate with the ground commanders on the ground to put the bombs on target with the fast movers and slow movers, to run search and rescue missions, to do the things that are required to support the ground commander. It is a very large challenge, but again, the planes we fly were not very interesting. This is a picture of the O2 Cessna 337, very basic airplane. The key inside the airplane was its radios. We had radios that, actually we had 4 radios, UHF to talk to the fighters, VHF to talk to the command and control element, 2 Fox mic radios so we could talk to 2 ground commanders at a time if we had to, and 1 more ADF. And what we found was the North Vietnamese had captured a number of our radios, FM radios, while we were there, and every once in a while they'd come up on net and try and spoof us. And when we do that, we could tell what was going on, and we just use the ADF to follow the needle and try and find the bad guys so that we could introduce them to a Mark 82 250-pound or 500-pound bomb. The other thing is on the last picture, whoops, excuse me. The last picture, we didn't have notebooks in the cockpit. In fact, the way I kept track of things going on, I had a grease pencil and I had lots of plexiglass to write on, and it was not unusual for us to take about a half an hour after we landed to transcribe all that for our after-mission report. Interestingly enough, this is a picture of David Hume Kennerly, who was a UPI photographer. When they found out that the facts were in and amongst the bad guys, they spent a lot of time trying to get the media with us so they could provide instantaneous report on what was going on. Now, during my tour in in Vietnam, I was assigned to a base called Ban Me To It, and we were doing a mission called Prairie Fire. And Prairie Fire was basically a mission where we would take long-range patrol teams from an austere base, use the 5 helicopters you see. The lead and the trail were both UH-1 Novembers, Air Force gunships, and the middle 3 were Slicks with the long-range patrol team in there. We drop them in the jungle someplace, come back and pick them up 5-6 days later, and they would gather intelligence and then try and figure out what was going on. We, the facts, knew that there was something big coming. We just couldn't predict what it was. Interestingly enough, this is an actual picture I was not supposed to take, but I thought it was historically interesting. This is an LRP. These are South Vietnamese soldiers dressed up as NVA, and you can tell by the AK-47s they had a lot of credibility when they did what they had to do. Now, this is a map of An Loc, and as you saw the picture, the orientation is to the north, and what you will see is basically the small town. Highway 13 is running straight north-south in the middle of the map. This is my 1 to 50,000 map that I used when I flew. And you can see the center of the town. All those little dots represent physical structures. And the reason that the An Loc was important to the NVA was it was a provincial capital. Well, its history was as a French center for the Michelin rubber plantation. And if you know anything about rubber trees, from above, you couldn't see what was going on below, but below, you could see 2 or 3 miles because they were all planted in perfect rows. Just to the east of the Highway 13 was a stream going north-south. You'll hear more about that in this presentation. And up in the upper right-hand corner was the airstrip called Quan Loy, which is the one I just showed you a picture of, where we used to do our special operations out of. Picture of An Loc. Why the destruction? Because as Dr. Steve told you, the NVA doctrine called for rolling thunder with artillery rounds, over 8,000 rounds a day into this town, and it shows you the brutality of an NVA approach to their own countrymen who they were trying to, quote, free. It completely destroyed the town. Picture of the center of the town, downtown, you'll see a picture of 7 tanks that were destroyed by both air and ground. And this is what it looked like on the ground. There was not a single vehicle with rubber tires that was still operating because of the shrapnel that was continually coming in. There's been a lot of discussion over the years about the ARVN. They were good fighters, but their leadership was bankrupt. This is a picture of an ARVN who had just killed a T-54 main battle tank with a light anti-tank weapon, a Law. The real hero here was air power, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps. We all participated in the event, and this is a 57 millimeter on a track-mounted chassis. Some of the heroes were the B-52 guys with their arc light strikes. The C-130 guys did an incredible job. You'll hear more about that during this presentation. And one particular day, I was fortunate enough to run a search and rescue operation that picked up 7 out of 10 crew members of this airplane, AC-119K, and this is called Stinger 4-1, and Mac McIsaac will tell you more about that. Picture of the SAR Force, the Great American. This was a Medal of Honor airplane. Standing in front of it was the lead pilot, Sandy 05. His name was Lamar Smith, and he eventually went on to become the CEO of First Command Investments after he separated from the Air Force. At the end of the tour, I got out, I was alive. I'd done what I was told to do, and I used my core values as a young Air Force guy with a great opportunity to learn here at the Academy. Now, next I'd like to introduce Ken Green to talk to you about the A-37 and the world of close air support.
The A-37 was the perfect aircraft for close air support in Vietnam. Only the A-1, which you saw there, the big propeller-driven aircraft, rivaled it in its ability to be in close and fighting. This is me in 1970. I went to pilot training. Check out the gig line there, guys. It's good.
Nice haircut. Huh?
Nice haircut, yeah. This is a year later when I was graduating from pilot training. These three guys right here, we lived together, all three of us, and we finished 1, 2, 3 in the class. Everything we did to get what we wanted, and that was fighters. Except the big guy in the middle, he's a 70 guy as well. He couldn't fit in a fighter, so he took a 141. I chose the A-37 and went to Vietnam. After training in Louisiana, I joined the 8th SOS Tactical Special Operations Squadron at Bien Hoa Air Base. It's only about 30 miles from Saigon. The day I walked in, they told me that the unit was going to close on 1 October 72, and that's only 7 months from when I got there. This is our aircraft on alert. We flew a lot of alert, and we went to An Loc a lot. I flew 253 missions in Vietnam in 7 months. 100 of them went to An Loc. It was only 12 minutes away from Bien Hoa. So when we would take off, we would immediately put up the gear and contact the FAC. We couldn't do anything without a FAC. We did have some issues, though. Our maintenance was excellent. I, in 253 missions, never had a ground abort, ever. However, due to attrition, we lost airplanes and we got down to having only 12 jets. And for 12 jets, we had airplanes on alert all the time. We didn't have enough to do the dailies, which we called frags. We had 3 pilots get shot down. We lost those pilots. We had 1 aircraft run off the runway, and the airplane burned up, but he was okay. He had battle damage, and his tire blew out. This is what his airplane looked like after it was done. This airplane was sitting in a revetment and was hit during a 122 millimeter rocket attack. It happened to be loaded with bombs at the time, and that was all that was left. We had 1 final aircraft that we lost, and this was a guy that landed short of Saigon trying to divert during weather, and he landed a mile short of the runway because of radar. Just took him right into the ground. The primary weapons that we carried in the A-37 inboard were 4 500-pound bombs. This particular picture was taken on Easter Day. If you look real close, you can see that the maintenance guys decorated the bombs. Outboard, we carried 2 250-pound bombs, or we carried rockets. I'm trying to get it to go. Not going? Won't go at all. We only had an iron sight. And now all that meant is that we looked through a triangle that was sitting on the top of the glare shield, and we dialed in mills depending on what weapon we were going to employ. Not only did we do Mark 82s, 500-pound bombs, but we also dropped 500-pound canisters of napalm. And when we carried napalm, on the outboard stations, we carried CBU. And CBU and napalm delivery was very, very hazardous. However, we were really, really accurate. The A-37 averaged missing the target by about 10 meters, dropping from 3,000 feet at 30 degrees of dive and at 300 knots. That's relatively slow for a fighter. I also went to Cambodia, where all the supplies into An Loc came through. And I went there 100 times as well. So in my 7 months in country, I flew almost 200 missions in and around An Loc. You have to be ready. Training is the key. You guys and gals right here, right now, this is your opportunity. Embrace it. I'd like to introduce my classmate, Jay Berry, who's going to tell you about the C-130 and how they kept those people on the ground alive in the city.
Thank you very much, Ken, and welcome to all of you from the class of 2024. Great to see smiling faces with you. I was a C-130 co-pilot, graduated from pilot training in August of '71, C-130 training in September, October, November. Went to a survival training at Fairchild Air Force Base in December, and then to jungle school, Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines in mid-December. And reported to Taiwan to the 21st Tactical Airlift Squadron, which was my assignment out of pilot training. Arrived there, and 2 days later, I was on an airplane in country, assigned to a crew starting to fly logistical missions throughout Vietnam. By the time the 1972 Easter offensive started in April, I was a pretty experienced co-pilot in a 130 business. Now, they set the stage for you, but basically, 3 North Vietnamese and Viet Cong division came from the north, 30,000 bad guys, surrounded An Loc, cut Highway 13 to Saigon, which was only 65 miles away. Resupply was done by Vietnamese 123s, and Chinook helicopters, they lost a bunch of those, and they called on the 130s to start making the airdrop resupply. We started that on April 15th. First 3 ship went into An Loc. First guy followed the road, which is in the second slide you can see, went right to the drop zone where the curve in the road as he entered the city. Got shut up pretty bad. Second guy said, that's not a good idea. He came from a different direction, but had an airdrop malfunction, had to wave off. The third guy took a tremendous amount of ground fire, engines on fire, and I'll talk about that in a second. So from that point on, we, these are the things that we faced at An Loc in the 130 business. SA-7s, 57, 37s, small arms, 51 caliber, all shooting at us from the northern part of the city where the Viet Cong and VC and the North Vietnamese held, and on hills all around An Loc, pointing and shooting as we approached the drop zone. The initial approaches for the drop zone were from random places about 30 miles away. We'd orbit. Facts would say, take this one. We'd come in day low level, 50 feet above the trees or so, to the drop zone. All the time getting shot at, because as soon as we started, the North Vietnamese would have their spotter say, you got a 130 coming this way. Quote from the Army, the missions to An Loc were the most dangerous faced by airlifters in Vietnam, and perhaps in any war. Gunners put up a gauntlet of fire when their spotters report an approaching 130. Crews faced small arms, 51, 23, 37, and 57. All of the low-level aircrafts took ground hits and were in battle damage. The wing had 4 squadrons. I was in the 21st. When we assumed the airlift duties in 15th, we were not ready. The wing had only a logistical mission before that. We had very few crews that were tactically airdrop qualified, very few people qualified to rig container delivery system drops, and very few people that would rig the airplanes to get ready to drop. But they persevered. On the 15th April, they sent out that 3 ship that I talked about. The result in the left picture is a gentleman by the name of Captain Bill Caldwell, knew Bill very well. Shut up very badly leaving the drop zone. Lost 2 engines on fire. Engineer was killed. Co-pilot, navigator, severely injured. Loadmasters in the back, burned by fire in the back, had to kick out 2 loads of 105 millimeter howitzer shells that were on fire before they exploded, which they did, leaving the airplane. They got back to Saigon, the aircraft commander basically solo, and the rest of the guys hurt. And the pilot and the loadmaster got an Air Force Cross for that mission. 18th of April, another aircraft crashed south of An Loc. The crew was rescued by the Army. That's the second and third picture. Army hunter-killer team, a Huey and 2 Cobras, saw them go down. Cobra sanitized the area while the Huey stopped and picked up all the crew members. I was number 2 behind that aircraft on my run-in when they were shot down. The low-level drops were terminated on 18th of April. We went to a ground release air delivery system. Because of the chutes and everything else, they didn't work. We went back to low levels the 23rd of April, and about 50 missions the next couple of weeks. And I participated in several night, blacked out, low-level drops into An Loc. And every one we got shot at and hit. 25th April, number 4 airplane went in, got shot down, right around the drop zone. I was 3rd behind that guy, and we got waved off. 3rd of May, another one was hit right after he completed the drop and shot down. They stopped the airdrop, went back to the grad system of airdrops, which they had perfected by now. And from that point on, that was the preferred resupply mission at An Loc. As a young co-pilot, facing what I did at An Loc, I relied on this training at the academy. You know your training, you rely on that training when things hit the fan. You also rely on your classmates, and in our case, crew members. And that was taught in spades at the academy. So much of what you're doing right now, you're going to see later if you ever do see combat. Thank you very much. Next, I'd like to introduce my classmate, Steve McIsaac. Mac Attack's going to talk about Gunship, the old $1.19 gunship.
Was I asleep up here when somebody came in and didn't say beaten Navy? I haven't heard it yet. Christ, don't you want to have goodies that happen after you win a commander's trophy? God, times have changed. Flew fixed-wing gunship. My primary mission was out of Nakhon Phanom in Thailand. Flew in Laos primarily. Flew a mission to in a place called the Plaine de Jars. Is this on? Yeah. Okay. Came home, had a beer with the crew, went to bed. And about 3 hours later, somebody kicked in the door and said, "Grab 2 flight suits and shaving kits. You're taking an airplane down to Vietnam." And about 3.5, 4 weeks later, I came home. We went to An Loc. It was about middle of April, so we were the first of 5 airplanes to come in. We had no leadership whatsoever, so our senior ranking captain became the detachment captain. Our crews were numbered 1 through 5, so the first guy, whoever was number 1, flew the first mission of the day, and then we just rotated through the cycle. 7th, 13th Air Force, they didn't know much about gunships and made it very clear. They started flying us in daylight. A gunship does not fly in daylight. We're slow, we're very low, 4,300 feet, 3,300 feet, and we provide a very large target for kind of like the 130s. We flew a lot, and I'm not bragging, never have, never will, but I flew 14 missions in 12 consecutive days, and that was the average. Many guys flew more than that. The only reason I didn't fly more, and we're about 3.2 hours per mission, which means on several days we double banged, came back, reloaded, refueled, went back to the scene. So it was very, very hectic. It was total environment change. We went down to South Vietnam and did urban warfare. Well, prior to that, we've been hunting trucks on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. So completely different. Like the general said, your training kicks in, you do what you got to do, and by God, you trust the guy who's sitting next to you or flying the airplane or whatever. So anyway, This is the All-American. That's the crew that shot down Stringer 401. We got 7 of the 10 were able to bail out for the aircraft crashed because, again, we were at 4,300 feet. There's not much time between that and the ground when you're hit by a 37 millimeter. I'm going to go ahead and introduce my next classmate here. I said, sir, you're kind of known around bouts. What do you want me to say? I said, well, don't you remember we were the same basic training squadron, summer basic training squadron? I said, oh, no, I wiped BCT out of my mind so long ago. It was pathetic. And he says, all right, well, then you'll remember that we went to the same group. I was in 24 and you were in 23. I said, yeah, I was in 23, but I never came up for air very often. So, but the funny thing was, the one thing he didn't want me to do was tell everybody that he and I went to Laredo, Texas, graduated on the same day, got our wings, and then ended up over here in this little town called An Loc, Vietnam. So,
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be here. That's the baby I got to fly about a year after graduating from the Air Force Academy. I found myself, we left Laredo with a new set of pilot wings, went to George Air Force Base, and started checking out in the F-4. We flew F-4Cs at George when we checked out. I showed up at Carrot Royal Thai Air Base on the 10th of May, 1972, and we had E-models, brand new aircraft. It was quite a change from a C model, which really didn't have any automatic equipment in it at all. This was quite a baby, and I thoroughly enjoyed flying it. I'm going to do a little different here. I'm not going to go through a bunch of pictures. What I'm going to try and do is give you an idea of what we were asked to do when we showed up in theater. I was at Carrot Royal Thai Air Base, about 600 miles from Hanoi, about 450 miles from Da Nang, about 400 miles from An Loc. We flew the entire range of South and North Vietnam during the period of time I was there for not only the Easter Offensive, but Linebacker 1 and then Linebacker 2. You can see the types of missions we flew there. If you take a look at North Vietnam, we were doing strike missions, usually 24 Mark 82s, until we got the laser-guided weapons in, and then it was usually 4 laser-guided weapons. We did escort for those aircraft that were striking and any MiGs that were going to get through. We had escort outriggers that would go air to air with those guys. Hunter-killer, that was an F-4 on the wing of an F-105. The F-105 was sniffing out where the radars were and using their standard arm missiles or anti-radiation missiles. If gunfire came up or if we got over the SAM site, the F-4 on the wing would then usually drop CBUs to destroy whatever SAM sites were on the ground or whatever artillery was there. Recce escort. Our F-4s out of Udorn would do post-strike and pre-strike photos so that we could see bomb damage assessment. We escorted them against MiGs that might come up. Fast FAC, just like what General Wasco was talking about, except in Route Pac 1, the southern part of North Vietnam is where we would escort where the fast FAC would fly because of the speed and the threat that we were facing. We would contact them and they would have us deliver ordnance on the target. South Vietnam, suppression of enemy air defenses against gunships, against C-130s, and in support also of B-52s. Close air support, and of course the out and back was an area that was really fun for us because we would go take off out of Carrot, have our weapons, hit the tanker, get to the pre-planned target that we're striking, or with a FAC, land at Da Nang or land at An Loc, rearm, refuel, take off, another mission with a FAC, back to An Loc or Da Nang, rearm, refuel, take off, strike targets, and then go back. So 3 sorties in a day was something that we really enjoyed doing. We did a certain number of aircraft would also go into Laos and Cambodia along the Ho Chi Minh Trail in suppression of any enemy air defenses, or in some cases striking targets that the North Vietnamese were using on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Let me spend just a couple seconds talking about some personal lessons. Number 1, If you aren't doing this today, I recommend you start a diary. At the end of the day, before you go to bed, a couple bullets about what you saw that day or did that day or piqued your interest. In a lifetime, you'll look back on that and be amazed at the kinds of things you not only accomplished, but the lessons that you may have learned. 2, physical fitness. The Navy and the Air Force are not as good about it as the Army and the Marines. They do their PT regularly, strenuously, and they're in shape. Air Force for too long had people take PT tests but do physical fitness on their own. While I was in Southeast Asia, and the people that are in Afghanistan and Iraq and all those places these days, those are strenuous days. You need to be in good physical condition, and it's something that's going to extend your life as well. You'll find this interesting. When I got into theater, one of the first things I was told to do was take a six-pack down to the comm shop, and they'll put you a patch cord to where you could then hook up a tape recorder that you would buy yourself so that you could record the missions, and then in the debrief, really the learning that takes place, because you can now, when you hear what the radio call was, you'll remember what you did, and you can do a much better job. I was amazed that in our aircraft, we did not have recording devices other than gun camera film, and it didn't work until you pulled the trigger. And how you got to that position was really very important to understand and to pass on to other people. All our airplanes have the recording devices today. We had multi-role F4s, but what I found worked best was when you specialized. If you had people flying at night, night requires different techniques and tactics than you use during the day. And those people that flew at night, as a specialized activity, were much better than those of us who flew in all the different missions all the different times. So I personally believe that we need to do a better job of specializing our units, maybe 1 or 2 types of missions instead of doing that whole array of missions that I talked about, if you really want to be good and be the best. 1 year revolving door. Interesting. You could be a lieutenant with 5 or 6 months experience. You were perhaps one of the more senior people in the squadron when it comes to experience, but low on the totem pole when it comes to rank. A lieutenant colonel or major would come in. They'd be a senior rank, maybe in a position of responsibility, but they were theater inexperienced. That causes some people problems. The flight lead is the flight lead no matter what the rank is, and usually the flight leads are the people with the most experience. Didn't always happen quite that way. I think you all have heard before that we learned some pretty significant lessons about unity of effort, unity of command. The way that theater was set up, it was nearly impossible for any one person to really know what was going on throughout the theater, because we had CINCPAC in Hawaii running the North War, we had General Abrams and COMUS MACV in Saigon running the Southern War, and Washington interloping in between with some very strategic guidance from Nixon and Kissinger. Last point I've got down there, technology really matters. When the laser-guided weapons came in, a 4-ship could deliver better accuracy and drop more targets that we had on the list than a flight than perhaps 20 flights of 4, dropping dumb bombs. We had electro-optical sensors that came in while I was there. We had electro-optical and infrared sensors. We had weapons that had those kind of guidance systems where you could lock onto the target before releasing the weapon, and it would hit the target every time. So technology really matters. Now I'd like to introduce my classmate flying B-52s, Larry Vonn. Larry?
I completed pilot training the end of July 1971 and was assigned to B-52Gs at Mayfair Air Force Base. In the month of September, I went to water survival training in Homestead Air Force Base, Florida, and then back to Carswell Air Force Base for SAC aircrew delivery, air weapons delivery. Arrived at Cassville Air Force Base about the middle of October for 16 weeks of combat aircrew training. The first 6 weeks was spent in the classroom studying the systems of the B-52 and in simulators getting familiar with the cockpit. We had 10 weeks then of flying training using B-52Fs at that time. At that, we were introduced to the crew, all 6 crew positions for our training missions. I had to share time with a pilot trainee who was transitioning from another aircraft, as well as another new co-pilot. One of the biggest challenge was learning to work with 6 crew positions, all trying to do their job to complete the mission. We trained using nuclear mission profiles, where we had air refueling, navigation legs, low level, and bombing. I don't. I reported to Mather about the middle of February then, in 1972. First flight in the G model was not until March of 72. Flying the airplane was just a small part of becoming mission ready. We had to, as a co-pilot, the controls for the Hound Dog cruise missile that we carried was on the co-pilot side, so I had to learn that. I had to learn all the procedures for the flying a nuclear mission, as well as command and control, the emergency action messages, and how to respond to that. So I became mission ready on April 27th, 1972, when I had my final check ride. And I was certified mission ready shortly after that, and assigned to a crew. We immediately went on alert, which was SAC's mission at the time. We went on what we were scheduled for a back-to-back alert. We came off alert on a Thursday, go back on alert the next Thursday. On Saturday night of that second alert tour, we were told to go home, get our crew rest, that we were going to Guam the next day. So my very first flight as a mission-ready co-pilot was 12 and a half hours from Mather to Anderson. At Anderson, we had 3 days of classroom instruction on conventional operations. My second flight on 27th of May was combat mission. For the next month, we flew combat missions mostly to Quang Tri. There were over 2,000 B-52 strikes in Quang Tri in the month of June. All the flights out of Anderson were 11 hours. D models, these are pictures taken during Linebacker 2. The B-52 D model was not as nearly as good as the G model as far as performance. And these pictures were taken from the same spot, and there's the D model taking off, and there's the G model taking off. And you see the difference in the performance of the two. The build-up responding to the Easter offensive accelerated, and by July we had 100 G models, 50 D models, and 12,000 personnel TOI at Anderson. Now I'll let Lou Hatch, my classmate, wrap up the performance.
Good afternoon, 24. Like the rest of us here, I graduated from the academy, going straight to pilot training. From pilot training, a couple of schools en route, survival schools, school on the O2 and becoming a FAC, and wound up at the top left corner there. Phan Rang Air Base, which was our in-country checkout for the O2 pilots coming in. And after that, I spent the next 18 months in Southeast Asia living out of an A3 and a B4 bag. First assignment was flying the O2. I was assigned as a Sundog FAC. Our primary area of responsibility at the start of An Loc was Cambodia. We were one of 2 units that were sanctioned to put in strikes in Cambodia. We were based in Tan Son Nhut Air Base, Saigon, and we flew a pretty heavy O2 load into Cambodia. Once An Loc started, the complexion of the war changed. Most of the U.S. Air and U.S. Army troops had left Vietnam itself. They didn't have anybody qualified to really be putting in close air support in MR3 when An Loc opened up. So they pulled all the Sundog facts down into MR3 and certified us for that. Also, if you notice dead center in this picture, there's a kind of a black spot. That's a place called Nui Ban Din Mountain. You'll see it here shortly. On the 4th of April, we received the surprise of a lifetime when the North Vietnamese came down Route 13 to head towards Saigon. This is a place called Loc Ninh. It was the first base they ran into. It was an Army base. We had one Army advisor there who was trapped in a compound with a small group of ARVN. And his unit, the whole unit, had left. The ARVN had retreated from there and headed for An Loc, and he was stuck with one small team and himself there. We worked him pretty heavily for 2 days. And it brings up one of the subjects I wanted to talk about, which was they asked me to look at our training when I was a cadet and what did I get the most advantage out of when I went to combat and when I went to Vietnam in particular. And I found a lot of things that we had gotten in military training, from summer training programs, air-based security programs. 3rd Lieutenant, I was lucky enough to go to Vietnam, fly 66 sorties with a 123 outfit, got into 28 fields. So I had a good idea what we were getting into. All of those things were good, but they weren't the biggest thing. The biggest thing, and I know you have all heard this, you go to war for your flag, your country, and your family. Same reason you join the military. You fight in a war for the man next to you. And you all are in your first foxhole. If you look to your right and your left, you'll see your classmates that you went through basic summer and 4th class year with, and that was your first foxhole. Those are people you'll never forget. 50 years from now, you'll be sitting on a stage with those people, and you'll be there because you came to see them. The same thing happens here. One of the things you have to understand is when you leave this place, that's not the end of your foxhole. Your foxhole moves, and it changes, depending on what you do. If you go to Space Command, if you go to tankers, if you go to fighters, it doesn't matter. Your foxhole will change, but there's always a foxhole, and you're always part of it. In this case, the O2 facts in the An Loc area had the biggest foxhole of all, because we talked on a continuous basis with all of the Army grunts. They were in our foxhole, or we were in theirs. We talked to them continuously. I talked to everybody on this stage except possibly the B-52 guys. They were pretty much handled through an RBS site. But we had a lot to do with their targeting. And we all were talking to each other. In this case, at Loc Ninh, there was a gentleman by the name of, or call sign of Zippo Whiskey. His name was Mark Smith. He was an Army captain, and he was on the end of that runway getting attacked by tanks and infantry in an NVA push. He was kept alive for 2 days strictly by air support, mostly A-37s that Ken Green was flying. And we were working in extremely close quarters there. On the night of the 5th, Sundog Fact, Dave Patterson was working with Zippo Whiskey when Zippo said, "I'm going to be overrun." He said, "I need the next strike on my position." Those are words that you don't hear very often, and the words that, as a fact, you never wanted to hear, because now you were going to put in a strike on his position. He says he's dead. They brought in the strike. It was a set of A-37s loaded with napalm and CBU-25. Dave didn't want to put that in because the napalm would kill him. So he brought in the strike and made 2 passes of CBU-25 with the most accurate bomber in the world, that A-37, and put the strike across the top of Zippo Whiskey, and the enemy started to retreat from the CBU-25. Then he ran the next 2 passes of napalm and killed the enemy. Zippo Whiskey survived that strike. But a little while later, on the 5th, he called up Dave Patterson again and said, "Sundog, they're in the hallway. Tell my wife I love her." Ends well, though. He was released in 1973 as a prisoner exchange after the ceasefire of the war. The Black Mountain I showed you in the center there is called Nui Ba Din. It was right on the north side of Tay Ninh. The enemy also attacked this while they were attacking An Loc, which was a good ways away. The reason they attacked this mountain is it's a high mountain overlooking Tay Ninh City right on the Cambodian border. The reason we cared about it was sitting on top of it was a facility called Sundog Alpha, and that was our radio relay for all tactical operations in Cambodia. They overran this facility on the 9th. On the 10th, we tried to take it back but failed, and we operated without Sundog Alpha for the next 2.5 months. An Loc itself became a very serious close air support war. This is the town of An Loc itself. I don't know if I can show it from over here. But the center of town right here, that road that's running through the center of town is basically the forward edge of the battle area. The friendly command compound is right here. The soccer field is right here. That's the the C-130 drop areas. And you can notice that the north end of town here is kind of blown up. And the reason that's the case is we were working airstrikes in there, A-37s and fast F-4s, on 7 PT-72s and T-34 tanks that were rolling in the city. And we worked that all the way up to the edge of the battle area. Here you can see, this is the 1 to 50,000 map of the area. The thing that happened when the major push came, the major push at An Loc came on the 11th of May. And when this came, we had one of my classmates, John Hazelton, Sundog Fack, was out working in the north end of An Loc, working A-37s and F-4s on tanks, and he disappeared. We were pretty sure he was shot down, but we didn't see it. The guy that was working with him, Barry Almond, was looking for his crash site, trying to find it to determine whether we could run a SAR or not. And we never, at that point, we had not found John's wreckage. Barry was continuing to work strikes on the tanks in the area. He was working an A-37 strike headed by Mike Blassie, also my classmate, Hawk 04, and Mike Blassie also went in. Barry Almond was emotionally distraught at that point after just losing 2 airplanes and told Pawnee Target that he was going to RTB, return to base. He was unable to do that because the Army commander said, "No, I've got to have these tanks knocked out." Barry turned back around and did his job. He went back and started working and asked for me to come up and support. I was working west of town at the time, and I came to help him. I ran out of fuel, had to RTB back to Saigon. By the time I landed at Saigon, Barry Almond was down. We'd lost 3 airplanes that day, 2 O2s and an A-37, all to SA-7 fire. The next day, on the 12th, they looked at the damage, and that's the first day we had the SA-7s come up. General Waskow and myself both had SA-7s launched at us that first day on the 11th. On the 12th, I went out there with 3 O2s. We had Tom Case, a 62 graduate who was our boss, Bob Murphy, and myself. And Tom Case was working the north end of town and the east end of town, trying to knock out the anti-aircraft artillery in those areas. Major Murphy was working right in town at the FEBA, and he was putting A-37 airstrikes within 25 meters of friendlies, and he was working active tanks there. They were in that range. They asked me to come up and work on the west side of town, right about where you see that circle, because they were taking anti-aircraft fire over the city. And the enemy had a habit of moving their guns back, their 23s and their 37s that create an airburst, moving them back from the city, allowing them to put a flak level right over the city at working altitude. And that's where they had moved them to, west of the city. So I went out there and I rolled in to put in my first smoke for a set of F-4s. And as I was pulling off, rolled over to look at my smoke, the fighters asked which smoke. So I rolled the other way, and there was a second smoke that was an SA-7. that was coming up. We had raised our working altitude to 6,500 feet. That gave me time to see it and to execute a split S, and it unlocked going over the top of my position. As I was pulling out the bottom from that split S, they called a second launch, the fighters did. I looked, picked it up, and it was much closer to me, so I did a power-on split S trying to change my position as much as possible, fly out of the tracking head. I was able to do that, but as I pulled out the bottom, they called a third launch that I never did see. And I was out of ideas and altitude at this point. I did an accelerated stall, over-G'd the aircraft, did an inadvertent snap roll into an inverted spin, into an erect spin, into a recovery. And as I pulled out going west, I asked the fighters, do you have the smoke from the last launch? And they said, affirmative. I said, you're cleared hot. One pass, haul ass, ripple all. That means clean the wings. One pass, drop all your ordnance on that target, which they did while I was trying to climb up to get back to working altitude. When I did, I found out my front engine was vibrating real badly. I had overstressed the aircraft grossly. The O2 was stressed at 3.8 Gs. I did 6.5. It was rolled to 2.5 rolling Gs. I did 4.5. Negative Gs, I don't even know how many I did. And I oversped it and oversped the engine as well. And as I pulled out and started applying power to try to climb back up, the front engine's vibrating really badly. So I have to use a reduced power setting. I start to climb back up and come back into the area, and I wanted to go home. I'd had a pretty badly damaged aircraft, and they said, I looked over there, and they're still working. Bob Murphy's still working in the center of town at a low altitude with A-37s. Tom Case is still working on the east side of the town. And I still had guns. So we rolled in, and I used 6 more sets of air on that target. Silenced them before I RTB'd for fuel. When I got down, that airplane didn't fly for, I think it was 3.5 weeks while it got straightened out. This basically is the tactical air support picture at An Loc. April, May, June, we flew 3,000 O2 sorties. We flew 4,500 strike sorties, and that's, or strike flights, and that's 11,000 strike sorties. There was our primary close air support weapon. That and the AC-130s, we used them extensively as well. And that's what the town looked like about mid-May. You can see that we're getting closer and closer to the friendly forces, and the band of area that's not heavily damaged is getting smaller and smaller, and that's because the lines are getting closer and closer together. Bomb damage assessment, BDA, they call it. The only thing I'd mention there, those two things right there, 105 and 155, those are U.S. weapons. I had 11 and 1. Those were when Firebase Pace and Thinyon were overrun. They abandoned those weapons, and we had to go destroy them the next day. The rest of those are their weapons. One group of people I wanted to mention that we did not mention today, we need to, were the tankers. This shows us, I'm flying with one of my classmates, Skip Bennett, in an A-37 one day just for kicks. We're out over Cambodia, and that's a KC-135 refueling 2 F-4s. I say that without those tankers, we probably would have had about half as much F-4 support and less than that of the B-52 support, both of which would have caused the loss of An Loc. So every man on this stage is responsible for that battle being turned. Without any one of them, whether it's the 130s making their drops, they were besieged for 66 days, and the only way they got supplies was from the C-130s. With the gunships, we worked them both to prep for the C-130s coming in, to work with the troops, to work at night with the ARVN patrols that were out, and they were hitting targets all over. We always had 4 FACs over An Loc, or the immediate regime of An Loc. We had 1 gunship minimum, usually 2. We had a minimum of 4 to 6 B-52 strikes, 3 ship strikes come through. And on the 24-hour period, 11th and 12th of May, General Hollingsworth got a B-52 strike every 55 minutes for 24 hours. That got their attention. That was all air support. And that picture's just there because it's pretty. That's my last view of Nui Ba Din, that mountain we looked at earlier, as I was on a T-39 for the last time passing Nui Ba Din, going to Udorn. And at Udorn, I joined a program called the Ravens. It was a Steve Canyon program, or Project 404, which is a classified civilian closed program in Laos.
So folks, that is our hour. We went over an hour, and for those of you in 2024, thanks for staying with us. We're going to stay here because now we're going to talk a little bit about some of the unintended consequences of the challenges that we faced in our careers, and we're also going to say a tribute to my classmates who are not here. First thing I want to talk about is the relationship between the military and the press. And I will show you these two pictures tell a story. And on the cover of Life magazine, I let Diana Ross control that picture, but if you look in the lower left-hand corner, there's a little subtext that says, "A pilot flies his last mission in Vietnam, goes home." The person in the upper right-hand corner of the picture is a gentleman named David Hume Kennerly. And during the war, as I said earlier in my introductory comments, the media always wanted to fly with somebody who knew what was going on. They couldn't fly in the fighters, couldn't have a seat for them. They didn't want to go in the airlift airplanes because they felt like they couldn't get the pictures they needed, so they flew with the facts. And Dave Kennerly flew with me a number of times in April and May of '72. He was a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, and in fact, if you remember the picture of the lone soldier standing on top of Khe Sanh, that was his photograph that earned him the Pulitzer Prize. Well, he went back to the United States, and in about June, he came back to Vietnam, and he said, "Tom," he said, "I got an idea for a story." And we had a great relationship. I called him the long-haired hippie freak, and he called me Yankee Air Pirate. But we knew each other, and we trusted each other. And so Dave said, "I want to do a story on a pilot's last mission in Vietnam." And I said, "Well, you know, you get that approved with 7th Air Force, I don't care. But remember, they're still shooting at us." And so he did get that approved. And so we went through about 3 weeks where he flew with me or flew with my wingman's airplane taking pictures. Took over 250 pictures. And those black and white pictures you saw earlier in our presentation were ones that he actually took. And so I said, "The only thing I ask of you is let me see the transcript of what you have written before it goes back to New York for publication." And he said, "We'll do that, but you have to understand, when that article leaves here, it is totally in the hands of the editors in Life magazine." And I said, "That's fair. As long as I know what you've said, I know I don't have the right to change it because you're the artist that created it, but I do want to know what you said, and if I disagree, I'll tell you." So he did. And so in early December of 1972, that Life magazine was published. And when I came back from Vietnam, let me start over. I'm a little ahead of myself. When I came back from Vietnam, I got a phone call from New York and said, "I'd like to come down and tie up some loose ends on your story." And so I said, "Well, that's fine. Go ahead and do that." They came down to Craig Air Force Base in Selma, Alabama, where I was re-signed as the T-38 instructor pilot. And the Wilton Woods, who was a feature editor for Life, said, "What was it like worrying about being the last pilot to be shot down in Vietnam?" And I looked at him and I said, "Well, let me tell you what facts do. My job is to save lives on the ground, to make sure the Americans don't get overrun," and I gave him what I call Fact 101. And he kind of nodded his head politely and absorbed the whole conversation. He went back to that very same question when I got finished. He said, "What was it like worrying about being the last pilot to be shot down in Vietnam?" And he kept hitting that theme. And then I talked to him about Stinger 4-1, which is a SAR that Mac told you about, where we saved the lives of 7 Americans who were shot down. In fact, as the story goes, I only counted 6 parachutes coming out of that airplane. The last guy bailed out was so low we didn't even see the chute, but we found him, and I used an Army dust-off helicopter to pick him up and get him out of there. So I told these stories, and Wilton Woods kept coming back to the same theme. And finally, I got mad at him, and I lost my cool, and I said, and I quote, "I sure as hell don't want to be the last pilot to be shot down, the second to the last, 453rd pilot to be shot down, but my mission is to save lives on the ground, and I'm going to do that. And if you start worrying about getting shot down, you're going to die one way or another." And he looked at me and said, "Okay." And I said, "Well, don't you want to know more about some of the things I told you?" He said, "No, I have what I need." And I said, "Okay, fine." So in early December, that magazine came out, Diana Ross on the cover, and this was, oh no, there it is. This was in 2-inch block letters on the right side was the lead quote from that interview. Now, it seems kind of funny and strange standing here some 50 years later, but I was devastated. And so I called Kennerly and I said, "David," I said, "how can this be?" He said, "Tom, what you don't understand, it's the power of the editor. When you do an article and it goes into the hopper, the editor decides what to do with it, what spin to put on it before it gets published." And that was his agenda. The reason was because Lee Ducteau and Henry Kissinger were in Paris at the time talking about ending the war in Vietnam, and this was what Life magazine wanted to say. Did I say the words? Yeah. Was that in my context? Hell no, it was not. So for those of you left here who are wearing shoulder boards, my message is this. Before you get interviewed, think about what you're going to say. Think of 3 things that you want your message to be. Whatever it is you're doing, think of 3 things you want to say and say those. And as they continue to probe, trying to get that quote, remember, now you can tell what they're going to do with it by the way they're asking you that question. Either stick with your 3 or say, "Thank you very much, interview's over." But be very, very careful. So that's my story about the media. Anybody have any questions about that? From the grads? Okay. The next thing I want, and that was my Finney flight, by the way. And you saw that picture earlier. And it's an interesting article if you get a hold of it, because there's nothing in that article about my quote. It was about a North Vietnamese who got a hold of one of our radios. He called me up on the FM network and wanted to harass me, and I was ADFing him to find him. I never did, but it was sort of an interesting flight. So, what I'd like to do now is transition to honoring some of our fallen classmates. My roommate, John Hazelton, as you heard the story about losing him, here he is playing with a rhesus monkey that was our mascot up at Bamituit when we were flying the Prairie Fire mission. And we used to wear the red scarves, red bandanas. And that kind of marked us because we had to take our name tags off when we flew because it was an unacknowledged program. In fact, we used to fly down to Saigon and go to the BX. And in Saigon, every once in a while, we'd be walking through the BX, and some colonel would walk up and go, "You're out of uniform, Lieutenant." We'd go, "Yes, sir, we are." He'd go, "Take off the red bandana." "No, sir, I'm not going to. My uniform." And he says, "Well, who are you?" And I said, "Well, we're Mike Fax, and this is our uniform, and we're going to leave now." And he said, "Well, who's your commander?" And he'd call the commander, and the commander would say, "You don't have a need to know." Haz was a great, great personality. This picture has a picture of me with another Fax sitting down, and the Fax sitting to his right with a hat on is Tom Case. Interesting enough, he was the cadet wing commander in the class of '69. And I knew him very well. He was and he still retired as a 3-star general. He was a commander of 11th Air Force and Alaskan Air Command. Great, great fighter pilot and guy. This is a picture of Dick Christie, was one of our first classmates we lost in Cambodia. Had a great sense of humor, but he was a wonderful human being. And this picture of both Dick and Haz in front of the mighty O2. I'm not going to go through the rest of these pictures now because I know that some of our other folks here on the stage might have something they want to add to what we've talked about up to this point. But at this point, I'm going to stop and ask you guys if anybody has any questions about anything we said, either the grads or these wonderful young men and women sitting in front of us. Y'all have any questions for the team? Is everybody awake? Oh, okay. That's good, too. On the front side, is there anything you guys want to add on a personal level that might increase the understanding of what we talked about today? We didn't have time for it with the full class, but with our classmates here, is there any other message you'd like to say?
You asked them to bring up the
Go ahead.
2 quick slides on Khartoum.
Sure. Doug, where are you, buddy? Are they here?
They're here somewhere.
Oh, I'm sorry. One last picture I want to show before we do. This is Art Hardy. He and I were in pilot training together. One of our classmates was shot down over the Ho Chi Minh Trail in his OB-10. He was missing in action for 10 years, and they finally did a determination on him. And rest in peace. Okay, is that yours you wanted to?
Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Here.
Just real quick, I wanted to mention one thing. While everything was going on in An Loc, remember that Easter Offensive was going on Central Highlands, Khartoum, Pleiku, and in the up north along the DMZ at Quang Tri. The situation in Khartoum was very similar to An Loc in that the 30,000 North Vietnamese coming from the north were mortaring and shelling, and this is the first time they used heavy artillery and tanks. As they moved into the airfield, there was a 3,200-foot strip that we used for resupply to Khartoum, unlike An Loc, where they did not have an airfield. C-130s were flying in there day and night, short field landings, taking in supplies and bringing out refugees. And I did some of that. And we got shot at as much as we did in An Loc and Khartoum. You remember the C-17 picture? 800 people. C-130, 260 people I brought out of Khartoum over the hill to Pleiku. But they followed a similar pattern. Night air lands, day air lands, first day, and then they got shot up too bad, went to night. And then lost a couple airplanes there, and finally it called off the air lands, and we began the airdrop. I was the second last airplane to leave Khartoum as the perimeter was being overrun. Combat control team said, get out of there, and get out of there right now. And we did, and there's an airplane behind us that landed, spun around, dropped the ramp, picked up the combat control team, and they left. Several 130s were on the ground there that had been mortared and destroyed. We lost one crew there in operations going on, coincidentally, with An Loc. So this was a similar situation where, again, the C-130 and its airlift capabilities kept Khartoum alive for several months, as it did in An Loc. Let me see, I go back here. Oops, excuse me. But a very small airfield, and the night operations, the way we got in there at night, smudge pots along the runway, and at the end of the runway, 2 Jeeps marking the landing zone with their lights. Took a sighting off the river bend to get to the airport and the runway. And those are the kind of things the 130 did that no other airplane could. It was a hands-on, fly it, navigate it, and an airplane that took 5 or 6 guys working as a crew to accomplish the mission. So, thank you.
Sir.
Can you all hear me? Yeah. If you haven't read the book that Tom recommended to us as we were getting ready for this discussion, I highly recommend it because that part of the war is not very well covered because, frankly, there weren't a lot of Army and Marine people engaged in that other than Reed Herring. And it's a book that Dr. Steve Randolph wrote called Powerful capstone class where all the service brigadier generals go for a 5-week program to make sure that they understand senior level decision making and joint operations and joint and combined operations. I also had an opportunity to go on overseas trips with those classes. One of the trips I took about 4 years ago was to Singapore, Vietnam, and Philippines, all of them dealing with combat operations, in addition to what kinds of things are going on with, from a commerce perspective, from an alliance perspective, coalition, and all of that. While we were in Vietnam, we saw Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, and of course Hanoi. But in between, we actually took a day to take a look at one of the largest tourist attractions there. They basically recovered a bunch of the tunnels that the Viet Cong used and lived in while they were fighting. One of the individuals, of course, we crawled through all of it, and there's places down there where hospital care could be given, food, sleeping, all of that. These were very elaborate tunnels, and not a lot of fun to crawl around in. They were made for smaller people than most of America. At the end of that, we talked to an individual who was a Viet Cong. He lost his left shoulder and left arm, but basically, at the end of any military visit, he will talk to those individuals about his experiences for 20 years fighting the French and then, of course, the Americans. He lived in the tunnels most of that 20 years. He talked about how he lost his shoulder and his left arm. There were 2 tanks he was going after. He only knew of one. There were 2 tanks. He killed one tank with a light anti-tank weapon. Didn't see the second one, which took off his shoulder. It took him about 6 months to recover from that, but then he went back to fighting, because that's his home. And they believed in what they were doing. In his discussion with us, it was very clear that he saw war from a completely different perspective than you would think. First of all, he had no animosity to American military people. They didn't like the French and they didn't like the Chinese. We were only 10 years. They'd been doing stuff with the Chinese and the French for decades. So he explained there were engagements he got into where he may have killed some Americans, but he shed a tear because they were warriors just like he was. They were brave, they were courageous, and they acquitted themselves well, but he just happened to win that day. He told us some of those stories. And in the end, he said, but having to do this life again, I wish that the human race would stop fighting and start enjoying one another. Wow. Think about that. Wouldn't that be nice? They were very impactful. By the way, we went to Hanoi. We took a look at the Walla, which was Hanoi Hill. It's now a war museum. They've got probably 20 rooms in there of displays. One room deals with the American War. They call it the American War. All the rest deal with their insurgency and activities against the Chinese, against the French, for, as I mentioned, for decades. Fascinating tour for those that haven't been. Going to Vietnam is certainly something that will sober you and give you a different perspective on what we were doing, and wouldn't it be nice if we could learn to live together?
Well done, Speedy. Now, for my class, I apologize for the selection of the 7 of us. I didn't have a whole lot of time to put this together when the idea came up, and Dr. Randolph, thank you so much for your support, hooking us up with the experts. Do I have any of our classmates who'd like to share any thoughts or any experiences in that particular part of the war? If so, we have some walk-around mic if you'd like to. And no one has any questions? Well, listen, thank you very much for your participation today. Obviously, with the class of 2024, This is our legacy. They will all join the long blue line at some point. They will have to make the decisions that you and I made with our families. And I also want to give a shout out to the military families. One of the things that Sheila and I focused on in the last part of our career when we had the responsibilities for the health and welfare of the families was the quality of life of those people. And as they say, we recruit the military member, but we retain the family. And the older folks here in the audience, let's continue to remind ourselves of that and continue to support programs like the USO, like veterans operations, veterans programs, certainly anything that can benefit these wonderful young men and women who continue to serve us. So thank you very much for your time. It's been very exciting for us to tell our stories, but hopefully we had an impact on these wonderful young men and women who are with us this morning. Thank you very much.